The reserve stretched for miles across the edge of wilderness. It was a place where nature and human care met halfway. Tall grass swayed under the wind, trees stood like quiet guardians, and the sounds of life filled every corner, birds calling, insects humming, and in the distance, the sharp cries of wild predators echoing under the night sky. Inside this land stood a research station. The people here had only one purpose: to study predator behavior and protect their young. They had built safe dens for cubs that had been orphaned or rescued, strong structures where the animals could rest, play, and grow. These dens were designed with care, warm, dry, with bedding that mimicked the natural dens they would have had in the wild. Every cub was monitored closely, because in the eyes of the researchers, their survival was a responsibility as heavy as stone. But then, something strange began to happen. At first, it was one cub. A worker making the evening round noticed that the smallest of the group had slipped away from the den. The bedding inside was untouched. The corner where it usually curled up was empty. The worker assumed it was hiding or playing outside in the dark. But when he checked the next morning, the cub had returned, tired but unhurt, slipping back into the den as if nothing had happened. It seemed like a small thing, until more cubs began doing the same. By the end of the week, the den that once held every cub safe and close now stood strangely quiet during the night. Rangers walked in with their flashlights, scanning the corners, expecting to find the young predators curled up in sleep. Instead, the place was empty. Their blankets were cold. The only trace of the cubs was the faint smell of fur, left behind in silence. Confusion turned to concern. These cubs had been rescued from harsh beginnings. Some had lost their mothers to hunters, others had been found starving and alone. For them, the den was not just a shelter, it was their new chance at survival. To see them walk away from safety was troubling. The Rangers gathered, voices low, debating what might have gone wrong. Could they be sick? One asked. Animals leave the group when they are unwell. Maybe they're hiding somewhere out of weakness. Or maybe the den frightens them, another suggested. It's built by us, after all. Too many human smells, too much structure. They may sense something unnatural about it. A third ranger frowned, more worried than the rest. Or maybe they are rejecting us. If they no longer trust this place, they might run wild. If they scatter, we'll lose everything we've worked for. The air grew heavy with worry. Every cub mattered, and to see them vanish each evening without explanation was a riddle none of them could solve. That night, a team stayed awake, taking turns near the den. They expected to see cubs fighting, stressed, maybe wandering to hunt, on their own. Instead, they saw something different. As the sun dipped and darkness wrapped the reserve, the cubs stirred restlessly. One by one, they rose from the bedding, padded to the door, and slipped out into the night. The Rangers followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. The cubs did not run far. They did not scatter into the wild or fight among themselves. They moved with purpose, their paws carrying them along a familiar path. "Where are they going?" whispered one ranger. Another shook his head, eyes straining to keep track. "Let's see." The trail wound past trees and across open ground, leading toward the older side of the camp where the human caretakers lived in small wooden huts. It was there, to the surprise of everyone watching, that the cubs stopped. Instead of curling in their den, the cubs sat quietly outside a single hut. They pressed their bodies close to the wooden walls as if they were guarding something precious inside. A low sound rose from one of them. Not a growl of anger, but a soft whimper, like a child asking for comfort. Then, as if on signal, the cubs settled down in a circle, their small bodies touching, their eyes half closed in drowsiness. The Rangers looked at each other in disbelief. "They're not lost," one whispered. "They chose this place." "But why? Why would wild cubs leave the safety of the den and choose a human's home instead? When morning came, the cubs slipped back into their den before most workers arrived. To anyone passing by, it looked as if they had been there all night. But the ones who had followed them knew the truth. The den was no longer their chosen place of rest. The rangers reported what they had seen, but not everyone believed them. Some called it nonsense. Predator cubs don't act like that, one of the scientists argued. They follow instinct. Dens are their blood memory. They wouldn't replace it for something as strange as a human's hut. Still, the pattern repeated. Night after night, the cubs vanished from their den and gathered at the hut. Soon, the entire reserve was buzzing with curiosity. The empty den became a symbol of mystery, and whispers spread that something unusual was happening, something beyond science. The researchers grew restless. Some feared this behavior would weaken the cubs, making them dependent on humans instead of learning to live in the wild. Others, however, began to wonder if it was not weakness, but choice. The cubs were not sick. They were not fleeing from fear. They were not rejecting life. They were seeking something they could not find in walls and bedding, but only in the presence of a human, and so the empty den became more than a problem. It became a question, one that reached deep into every person's heart. What was it about this human that made predators abandon instinct, abandon the safety of their kind, to rest instead at her side? The rangers did not have the answer yet. But as they watched the cubs disappear again that evening, leaving the den still and silent, they realized this was no accident. Something was changing, something that could not be explained by fear, hunger, or habit. The den stood empty because the cubs had made a choice that would soon reveal more about trust, kindness, and the bond between species than any of the humans in the reserve had ever imagined. The mystery of the empty den was finally revealed one quiet night. A ranger, troubled by the growing whispers, decided to follow the cubs more closely. She had seen them vanish before, slipping into the shadows like smoke, but no one truly knew where they went or why. That night, she kept her distance, careful to move slowly, her boots soft against the earth. The cubs padded silently ahead of her, their small bodies glowing faintly under the silver light of the moon. They didn't run wildly as young predators usually did. Instead, they walked together, as if they had one destination in mind, their little paws moving with certainty. The ranger's heart pounded. Was this the night she would finally understand? They passed the tall grass, the wooden fences, and the quiet barracks where the older animals were kept. Then, almost without hesitation, the cubs reached the far corner of the camp. There, a small hut stood, modest and unremarkable compared to the rest of the reserve. It belonged to one of the human caretakers, a woman who rarely spoke much, who lived simply, and who spent her days quietly carrying out her duties. She wasn't a trainer, not a researcher, not even a ranger like the others. She was assigned to small tasks, sweeping, carrying supplies, and sometimes preparing meals for the workers. To most people, she blended into the background. She wasn't known for commanding voices or giving orders. Yet, to the cubs, her hut was not just a structure, it was a place of refuge. The ranger froze in the shadows as she watched the scene unfold. The cubs moved toward the hut with quiet eagerness. Their small claws scratched lightly against the wooden floor outside as they circled around the side. Then, one by one, they pressed themselves down, curling against the wooden wall as if it offered them comfort. But it wasn't the hut itself that drew them. It was the person inside. The ranger peeked carefully through a gap in the shutters. Inside the hut, the caretaker was lying on a simple bed, a thin blanket pulled to her shoulders. Her breathing was calm, steady, the rhythm of someone already deep in rest. She hadn't noticed the cubs gathering. She hadn't called them or coaxed them with food. She hadn't even left the door open for them. And yet, the cubs lay there, eyes closing, tails flicking gently as they drifted into sleep. The sight was breathtaking. Predator cubs, wild, restless, stubborn by nature, who had resisted every form of training, were now resting like infants beside a human's room. No growls, no fighting, no anxious pacing, only peace. The ranger stayed there a long time, watching in disbelief. She had spent countless nights trying to understand why the den was empty, fearing disease, disobedience, or worse. But the truth was simpler, stranger, and far more powerful than anything she had imagined. The cubs had chosen the human's presence over their own kind. By morning, the cubs returned to their den before the camp stirred awake, as though hiding their secret. But the ranger couldn't stay quiet. She reported what she had seen. At first, no one believed her. "You're saying they left their den to sleep outside a human's hut?" "Nonsense," one of the senior researchers scoffed. "They're predators, not pets," another added. "They seek warmth, protection, food, not people. This makes no sense." But the ranger's voice was firm. "I saw it with my own eyes. They were not searching for food or shelter. They were resting, calm and safe, because of her. Not the hut, not the ground. Her." Skepticism rippled through the group. Some dismissed it as imagination. Others grew defensive, unwilling to accept that a simple caretaker could succeed where their studies and methods had failed. But curiosity burned stronger than pride. The next night, more rangers decided to follow, and the scene repeated. The cubs slipped, away silently, ignoring their den, ignoring the trails that once defined their world. They went directly to the caretaker's hut and laid down outside, waiting until they heard her steady breathing. Only then did they close their eyes, as if her rest was their signal that it was safe to rest, too. The rangers stood in silence, unable to speak. It was undeniable now. The bond was real. News spread quickly through the camp. Whispers filled the barracks, and every evening more eyes tried to witness the strange ritual. Some were moved by it, struck with awe that a human could hold such quiet influence. Others frowned, uneasy with the thought that predators could show loyalty or trust to someone who hadn't trained them. But inside her hut, the caretaker remained unaware of the storm she had stirred. She had not sought this bond. She had not tried to claim authority. She simply existed, patient and gentle, never forcing herself on the cubs, and somehow that was exactly what they needed. As days turned to weeks, the pattern deepened. The cubs no longer looked restless at night. Their wild energy, once untamed, softened when they approached her hut. They no longer paced or whimpered in the den. Instead, they seemed to save their calmness for her presence. Some of the researchers began keeping notes, fascinated despite themselves. "It isn't food. They never receive meals from her directly," one wrote. "It isn't dominance. She does not command them, does not even notice them until morning. It must be something instinctual," another suggested. "Perhaps they sense safety in her. Perhaps they smell something familiar, something mother-like." Yet even those explanations fell short, because what they saw was not instinct alone. It was choice. The cubs were not trapped. They were not bribed. They were not ordered. They chose night after night to leave the den and sleep near her bed. For the caretaker, the truth became clear only when she opened her door one early morning and found them still lying there. She blinked in surprise, unsure what to do. The cubs lifted their heads, blinking back at her, not afraid, not aggressive. One yawned, another pressed closer to the wall as if reluctant to leave. Her heart softened. She didn't chase them away. She didn't shout or call for help. Instead, she quietly stepped outside, sat near them for a while, and let the moment settle. And for the first time, the cubs didn't just rest beside her hut. They rested beside her. That was the moment everything changed. From then on, the bond was no longer hidden. The cubs no longer returned quickly to their den at sunrise. They lingered, choosing to follow her movements, their eyes trailing her as she worked. They didn't demand anything from her, not food, not play. All they wanted was her nearness. The camp watched with growing astonishment. The den remained empty, but the space around her hut became alive with soft sounds of cubs breathing in sleep, tiny growls of contentment, and the unspoken truth that this human had become something they could not find anywhere else. The researchers could measure their health, track their growth, and study their behavior, but none of their charts explained why. The rangers could guard the camp, build fences, and write reports, but none of their rules accounted for this choice. The cubs had made their decision. The den was only a structure, but the human's presence, that was home. The camp was no longer quiet about the strange bond. What had once been whispered in corners was now openly debated in meetings. The scientists and researchers gathered at long tables, their faces tense, voices rising as they argued over what they had seen with their own eyes. For wild cubs to abandon their den was not only unusual, it was unnatural. Every book, every record, every study of predator behavior stated the same truth. Young ones always clung to their den. It was their base of safety, their instinctive home. To see that den left empty night after night shook the foundation of everything the researchers believed they understood. Yet there was no denying what was happening. The cubs had chosen the human's side. Some of the scientists dismissed it at first. "It is only temporary," one said firmly. "Perhaps they are stressed. Perhaps the presence of the woman gives them comfort for now. But instincts will always win. They will return to the den soon enough." But others shook their heads. They had seen too much to call it chance. "Instinct does not explain this," one argued. "Instinct does not explain why they wait for her to sleep before they rest. It does not explain why they ignore their den completely night after night, when every other predator in history would never dare to abandon it." The debate grew louder. Was it science? Was it chance? Or was it something no study had ever accounted for? Outside those meetings, the truth was much simpler. The cubs did not care for arguments. They followed their hearts, and their hearts led them to her. Each night, as the camp grew quiet, the pattern repeated. The cubs slipped away, their paws silent on the ground, and they padded straight to her hut. No one guided them. No one coaxed them. And yet, their destination was always the same. She would be inside, perhaps sitting quietly after a long day, her hands resting on her lap, or her voice humming softly to herself. At first, she hadn't noticed their loyalty, but now she understood. They would not lie down until she did. They waited, restless but patient, their eyes following her every move. When she finally lowered herself onto her small bed, pulling the blanket gently over her shoulders, the cubs would settle with relief. Their bodies curled together, pressing close to her wall, their eyes growing heavy the moment she closed hers. It was not just instinct, it was trust. Her calm voice, so different from the sharp commands of trainers, was never raised in anger. Her hands, unlike those that forced or restrained, only moved gently, offering no threat. And her patience, quiet and endless, asked nothing of them, demanded nothing from them. She simply existed with them, and somehow that was enough to make them feel safe. The scientists tried to measure it. They scribbled in their notebooks, trying to record every detail. "Her tone is soft, always low," one observed. "Perhaps this calms them," another added. "Her body language does not mirror dominance. This could be why they do not resist." But those words felt thin compared to the reality, because what they were seeing was not only about her behavior. It was about the connection the cubs chose to form with her. She had become more than a caretaker to them. She had become something their den had failed to provide, comfort that went beyond instinct. Even the rangers, who had grown used to the harshness of predator behavior, began to notice the difference. The cubs no longer snarled or paced restlessly when she was nearby. Their aggression softened, their eyes grew calm, and their tiny growls turned into quiet sighs. Some rangers found themselves standing outside her hut at night just watching the strange sight. At first, they were there out of duty, to ensure safety in case the cubs turned violent. But slowly they realized there was nothing to fear. The cubs were gentler with her than they had ever been with their own kind. "Look at them," one ranger whispered during a late watch. "They're not just calm, they're at peace, as if they belong there." The other nodded quietly. "It's not just instinct. They've made a choice." And that was the truth that shook everyone the most. These cubs, born with wild instincts, raised under strict training, had made their own choice. They chose the human side not because they were told to, not because they were forced, but because they trusted her. The scientists began calling it an anomaly. The rangers called it a mystery. But to the woman, it didn't feel like either. To her, it was something far simpler. One evening, as she stepped outside and saw the cubs waiting patiently at her door, she knelt down on the ground. She reached out her hand, not to command, not to hold, but simply to offer. One of the cubs hesitated, its nose twitching, before pressing gently into her palm. Its fur was coarse, warm, alive with quiet strength. In that small touch, she felt what the debates and notes could not capture. This was not about instinct. This was about trust. The cubs, who had growled at chains, snapped at commands, and resisted. Fear had lowered their guard for her. They trusted her not because of what she demanded, but because of who she was. And trust, once built, was stronger than instinct. Over time, the bond deepened. The cubs not only slept by her side, but began to follow her movements during the day. When she walked across the camp, they trailed behind at a respectful distance, their eyes always watching. When she stopped to rest, they circled near, their bodies forming a quiet shield around her. The scientists grew restless. "This cannot continue," some argued. "It disrupts their natural behavior. They must be returned to their den." But returning them to the den no longer worked. The cubs resisted, clawing at the ground, refusing to stay once night fell. They always slipped back to her side, as if drawn by a thread stronger than any rule. The camp could not ignore it anymore. Every evening the sight became familiar, the den standing empty, and the cubs gathered around her hut instead. What unsettled many was not just the behavior of the cubs, but the quiet strength of the human herself. She had not sought this influence. She had not tried to claim power. Yet her presence alone had reshaped everything they thought they knew about the predators. It was no longer just about where the cubs slept. It was about what it meant. If predators could place their trust in a fragile human, then perhaps trust was not bound by instinct, not limited by species, not locked inside tradition. Perhaps trust was something greater, a bridge that connected where logic could not. And so the camp began to change. The debates did not end, but the tone softened. The rangers no longer doubted their safety when the cubs were near her. The researchers, though frustrated, began to admit that the bond was undeniable, and the woman, still quiet, still patient, continued her simple life. She swept the floors, carried supplies, and returned to her hut each evening. She did not claim credit, did not boast of what had happened. But when she lay down at night and felt the steady presence of the cubs breathing outside her wall, she knew something rare had been built. A trust that no chain, no command, no fear had ever managed to create. It was trust beyond instinct, and that trust had become unbreakable. Days slowly turned into weeks, yet the strange new pattern never faded. If anything, it grew stronger. Each evening, as the sun sank behind the reserve and the shadows stretched long across the ground, the cubs made their way to her hut. They never missed a night. No matter what happened during the day, whether storms rolled across the land or whether rangers tried to keep them near the den, the cubs always returned. At first, the rangers thought it was just a phase, a passing behavior that would fade with time, but they soon realized this was no accident, no temporary habit. The cubs had made a choice, and their choice was her. She became their center of calm, their silent guardian. When she stepped outside at dusk, the cubs gathered around her, brushing against her legs as if to confirm she was still there. They didn't wait for food. They didn't demand attention. They simply wanted her nearness. And when she finally lay down to rest, they curled into the earth outside her small hut, their eyes closing only when they knew she was safe. It was not only the cubs who noticed the change. The older animals in the reserve began to act differently as well. Beasts that once stayed distant now approached her slowly, cautiously, as though sensing something invisible around her. A large predator, one the rangers had always feared for its wild temper, once came close while she was carrying water. The rangers tensed, hands ready to intervene, but the animal merely lowered its head, brushed past her gently, and walked on. The rangers stood frozen. It was something they had never seen before. What force they had tried to impose with barriers and commands, she seemed to draw out with nothing more than patience. Where others used whips or orders, she used silence. Where others built cages, she built trust. The rangers began to whisper among themselves. "It doesn't make sense," one muttered. "We've spent years trying to control them with strict rules. She does nothing, and yet they listen to her." Another shook his head, watching as the cubs followed her quietly back to her hut. "Maybe it's not about control," he said softly. "Maybe it's about something else." The camp was not the same as it had once been. The restless growls of the cubs at night had faded into quiet breathing. The sound of cages rattling, of trainers shouting, of animals resisting, these too began to disappear. A new rhythm settled in, calmer, steadier, and at the center of it all was her. But the human herself did not see it as power. She never thought of herself as a leader, or as someone special. To her, it was simple. They came to her because they trusted her, and she could not turn them away. Each evening, she prepared a small space outside her hut. She swept the ground clear, making room for the cubs to curl up comfortably. Sometimes she spoke to them softly, her voice carrying no commands, only warmth. She told them simple things, about the sky, about the trees, about the quiet. The cubs didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Her voice was peace, and that peace reached them more deeply than any order ever could. The rangers, who once laughed at the sight, now found themselves respecting it. Some even began to copy the way she moved, lowering their voices, softening their steps when near the animals. Slowly, without realizing it, they were learning from her. The bond between her and the cubs was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a lesson. One afternoon, a storm rolled through the reserve. The wind howled and rain hammered down, shaking the trees and flooding parts of the camp. The animals, unsettled, grew restless. Many rangers rushed to secure barriers and check cages, fearing chaos. But when they reached the cubs, they were stunned. Instead of panicking, the cubs had gathered, tightly around her hut, their small bodies huddled close together. She stood at the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame, speaking softly to them even as the storm raged. Her calm steadied them, and soon their growls faded into quiet whimpers, then into silence. The storm passed, and not once had the cubs tried to flee. When the rangers saw this, they could no longer deny what was happening. It was not coincidence. It was not chance. It was something real. From that day, the whispers in the camp grew louder. Some called her bond with the cubs, a gift. Others feared it, worrying that her influence might disrupt the natural order, but no one could ignore it anymore. The older animals, once untouchable, now watched her with eyes that carried recognition. They did not bow, but they did not resist either. And when she walked through the reserve, even the most dangerous creatures stayed calm, their wild energy softened by her presence. To the rangers, it was a revelation. They had always believed control came from dominance, from being stronger, harsher, louder than the beasts they guarded. Yet here was a fragile human who had achieved what none of them could, without force, without chains, without fear. The cubs had chosen her, yes, but now it seemed others were beginning to follow. And so the bond grew, not only between her and the animals, but between her and the people who watched in silence. The rangers began to wonder if maybe they had been wrong all along. Maybe the creatures were not meant to be controlled by fear. Maybe they only needed to feel safe. The woman never claimed to have the answers. She never stood before them and explained her ways. She simply continued her quiet care, offering warmth where others offered cold and trust where others offered doubt. And slowly the world around her began to change. By the time weeks had passed, the den still stood empty each night. But no one worried anymore, because what had once been seen as defiance was now seen as proof that bonds could be stronger than walls, and that kindness could succeed where commands had failed. The cubs had found their place at her side, and in doing so, they had reshaped the hearts of everyone who watched. The growing bond was no longer just a mystery. It was a truth, and it could not be denied. Word of the strange bond did not remain within the reserve for long. At first, it spread through whispers among the rangers, shared in quiet conversations during their breaks. Then researchers visiting the area carried the story back to their universities, their colleagues, and eventually to the wider world. The tale of predator cubs abandoning their den to sleep beside a human was too unusual to stay hidden. Soon, people from far away wanted to see it for themselves. When visitors first arrived, they expected tricks. Some thought the cubs must have been trained with food rewards. Others imagined cages or invisible barriers forcing them to act tame. But when they stepped into the reserve and saw the truth, their doubts faded. There were no chains, no commands. The cubs simply chose her. Each evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the animals left the empty den and padded quietly toward the hut. They did not look back. They did not hesitate. Their paws carried them straight to her side, where they curled down in the dirt or grass, as if the ground itself became softer in her presence. Only when she closed her eyes did they finally let theirs rest too. For the visitors, it was both humbling and moving. Predators that could not be swayed by strength or control had given their trust freely to someone who asked for nothing in return. Word spread further, reaching beyond scientists and animal lovers. News writers published stories. Images of the cubs resting at her door began to appear in articles, photographs shared again and again. People all over the world marveled at the sight of wild creatures choosing peace. Some called it a miracle. Others called it proof of something deeper, a reminder of how life could connect across species when fear was replaced with care. The reserve began receiving more attention than it ever had before. Reporters arrived carrying cameras, asking endless questions. They wanted to understand how she had done it. But she had no complicated explanation. "I didn't teach them anything," she would say quietly. "I just stayed with them. I was patient. They came on their own." It was the simplicity of her words that struck people the most. In a world that often tried to make solutions complicated, she offered one that was as old as time itself: trust. The cubs continued to grow, but even as they became stronger and larger, their bond did not weaken. Their loyalty deepened with age. When they roamed the fields by day, they still returned each evening to rest by her side. Visitors often asked if she was afraid that one day they might turn against her, their instincts overpowering the bond. But she only shook her head. "They are not mine to control," she explained. "I just trust them, and they trust me." And that was enough. The den itself remained unused, dust gathered in its corners, the straw beds untouched. What had once been built as a shelter for young predators stood silent, a symbol of something greater. It was no longer needed, for the cubs had chosen another home, one not made of wood or stone, but of presence, warmth, and trust. Scientists who studied the cubs began to notice changes in the camp as well. The other animals seemed calmer. The air of constant tension, once heavy across the reserve, had begun to lift. Rangers who once relied on shouts and barriers now walked more quietly, choosing patience over force. Slowly, without planning, the entire reserve was reshaped by the quiet influence of a single human and the cubs who chose her. The story began to be told not just as an odd event, but as a lesson. Schools shared it with students, using it as an example of how kindness could succeed where commands failed. Conservation groups spoke about it when discussing the relationship between people and wildlife. Even ordinary families far away from the reserve repeated it at their dinner tables as a reminder that peace often comes not through control, but through understanding. The woman herself never asked for recognition. She lived simply, continuing her work as before. To her, it was never about attention or fame. It was about the cubs, about making sure they felt safe, about giving them a place where they could rest without fear. That was all she had ever wanted, and in return, the cubs gave her something far greater, proof that gentleness had power. The visitors who left the reserve carried more than photographs. They carried stories, feelings, and questions. They asked themselves why force was always the first choice when trust could be so much stronger. They wondered if the same truth could be applied beyond the reserve, in homes, in schools, in communities. If wild predators could choose peace, what might people achieve if they learned to trust each other the same way? And so the story lived on, growing larger with each retelling. The empty den became more than a physical place. It became a symbol. To some, it represented freedom. To others, it represented choice. But to most, it stood as proof that sometimes the strongest walls are not built from stone, but from trust freely given. The cubs never returned to the den, but no one saw that as a loss anymore. Instead, it became a reminder. They had not abandoned their home. They had found a better one. Their choice was not about rejecting the den, but about choosing the side of a human who gave them peace without asking for anything in return. And that choice changed more than their lives. It changed the reserve, the rangers, the visitors, and even the people far beyond who only knew the story through words and pictures. The den stood empty, yes, but it was not a symbol of emptiness. It was a symbol of fullness, of bonds that crossed boundaries, of lessons that would not be forgotten. The lesson was lasting, carried in every whisper, every retelling, every heart moved by the image of cubs sleeping peacefully beside a human. And so the story of the empty den was never truly about loss. It was about finding. Finding peace where none was expected, finding trust where instinct said there should be fear, finding that even the strongest predators could bow to kindness. The reserve would never be the same again, nor would the people who had witnessed it. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night, as the cubs rested safely at her side, the world itself seemed to breathe a little easier, reminded that sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful. The den stood empty, not because the cubs were lost, but because they had found their home at the side of a human,